Jote, wir gucken dann jetzt Big Mistakes in Gaming News featuring @Omni von DidYouKnowGaming. Ich habe im Thumbnail schon Masahiro Sakurai gesehen und den zitiert man andauernd falsch. Gewissermaßen wurde ich da eventuell geklickbaitet, ne? Aber es ist ein DidYouKnowGaming Video. Ich bin wirklich sehr gespannt drauf, was die Jungs mir zu sagen haben. Und Omni, ist das nicht der den Rayman League gemacht hat? Wenn es der ist, dann geil. Yo, bin am Start. Hauen wir rein.
Gamers have a bottomless appetite for news from Japan.
Oh nee, das ist der andere da mit der Tasse immer.
Hear some behind-the-scenes stories about their old favorites, and maybe even get a glimpse of their favorite developers' personal lives. There's just one little hang-up. Most of them can't speak a word of Japanese. Google Translate and other computer programs are notoriously horrendous when it comes to translating Japanese. And even if they weren't horrendous, most fans wouldn't even know where to look for the information they want to read about. Japanese magazines, books, websites, newspapers, it's simply not practical. So fans are left with no choice but to put their trust in games journalists, Reddit users, and various other internet strangers to find and translate all the Japanese gaming news that's fit to print.
Ja, was die Sache angeht, eine Quelle, die ich sehr empfehlen kann, die sich auch wirklich bewiesen hat, ist Source Gaming. Deren Motto ist es einfach immer zurück zur Quelle zu gehen, und wenn sie irgendwas nicht direkt von der Quelle haben, bleiben sie so lange unentschlossen, bis sie die Bestätigung wirklich haben. Aber ja, Japanisch ist eine leider sehr krasse Sprachbarriere noch. Das kann nicht einfach mal so eben jeder lernen. Und Journalisten, die suchen ganz gerne mal einfach den schnellen Sensationsbeitrag, greifen dann selbst auf was ich Google übersetzt hat, zurück. Und irgendwelche Fremde im Internet können dir irgendeinen Unfug erzählen. Aber wie sollst du es wissen? Du kannst nicht Japanisch sprechen. Das ist echt kompliziert, leider.
But sometimes these translations are actually mistranslations that spread misinformation and create controversy.
Yeah.
So, in today's video, we're going to look at 4 mistranslation controversies heard around the world and find out what the developers actually said.
Okay, da bin ich mal gespannt.
First on our list is Junichi Masada, the Pokemon series director who's ruffled quite a few feathers throughout his career. From the Azure flute controversy to the egg-hatching debacle and the Bayleaf backlash, the man's received his fair share of criticism over the years. In fact, we could probably fill an entire video with nothing but Masada controversies. But we'll save that for another day. In the quote we're highlighting in this video, he didn't actually say what news sites reported. In July 2018, Masada sat down for an interview with Japanese magazine Famitsu to discuss a wide range of topics about the upcoming release of Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee. Soon after, a popular fan site called Centro Pokemon published an article translating parts of the interview into Spanish, which said Masada was removing wild battles from the game because, quote, some players find it difficult to catch Pokemon with the traditional mechanics of the main series, so he switched to the Pokemon Go style to make catching more accessible. A few hours later, a fan translated and summarized the Spanish article into English and posted it on the Resetera forums, where fans were horrified that Masada had such a low estimation of his own fans' intelligence. Word quickly spread to Twitter, and that's when people really started to get upset.
Ja, also, wenn Leute irgendwas nicht, wenn sie irgendwas mitbekommen, was denen nicht gefällt, ist die erste Anlaufstelle ist immer Twitter. Es ist immer Twitter. Und darüber verbreitet es sich dann immer weiter. Das ist so ein exponentieller Wachstum. Und es geht einfach, der ganze Zug fährt mit Höchstgeschwindigkeit gegen die Wand. Und Matsuda, der kann nichts dafür. Der kann absolut nichts dafür und kriegt einen riesen Hass ab, weil irgendjemand meint, eine Arbeit, nachdem man nebenbei gar nicht gefragt wurde, beschissen zu machen. Danke für gar nichts.
Outlets like My Nintendo News immediately picked up on the story, and before the day was over, an angry mob of Pokemon fans were outraged that Masuda was cutting wild battles in order to appease small children who were incapable of grasping the series' most basic mechanics. However, that's not what Masuda actually said in the interview. The next day, Nintendo Everything posted an accurate translation of the quote. Masuda says he thought of the previous system as similar to fishing, while the new system was more like catching bugs with a net. Wild battles were getting cut, but it wasn't because he thought his fans were idiots. It was really more about trying something new and trying to build a bridge between longtime fans and all the new fans drawn in by Pokemon Go.
Also, schlicht und ergreifend das Fehlzitat war, die es nicht verstehen, sind Idioten und ich will, dass die da dazukommen. Und das andere ist halt, ich will Neueinsteigern einen besseren Einstieg geben, einen einfacheren Einstieg. Und im Grunde das eine ist einfach beleidigender als das andere. Ne? Also, oh.
Some people still didn't like his decision, but at least they didn't feel insulted about why the decision was made in the first place. A few websites that amplified the mistranslation later updated their articles with the corrected language, but a lot of fans never heard about those updates. As the old saying goes, a lie can travel halfway around the world while the truth is putting on its shoes. In this case, no one lied intentionally. It was really just a case of poor fact-checking, but regardless, much of the damage was already done.
Ja. Das kam natürlich sofort überall an, weil warum sollte man jetzt dann, wenn man schon groß seinen Hass verbreitet hat, jetzt auf einmal einen Tweet raushauen, wo sie sagen, oh, ich lag nebenbei falsch oder ey, das ist doch nicht so, Hass treibt die Leute halt an. Die Leute werden so krass von negativen Emotionen getrieben und es zeigt sich jetzt in dem Beispiel so gut. Unangenehm, richtig unangenehm.
Next on our list is a misquote of Final Fantasy VII's director Tetsuya Nomura. About a year before Final Fantasy VII Remake was finished, Nomura sat down for an interview with Japanese magazine Weekly Famitsu. Soon afterwards, Eurogamer published a summary translation that read in part, "It was necessary to restrict her chest," Nomura says in the interview. But as the ethics department pointed out, Tifa shouldn't look, quote, unnatural during action scenes, so her chest was, quote, restricted. Eurogamer's article got a lot of attention on social media, so Polygon wrote an article of their own that assured its readers, "I'm not here to tell you that worries over Tifa's breast size are a sound discussion, because they aren't. If the Mortal Kombat 11 debacle surrounding breasts taught us anything, it's that people are really attached to big boobs no matter what the context." Similar articles made their way onto news sites like GameRat, Metro UK, and The Gamer, with each version of the story getting clickbaitier and clickbaitier as time went on, eventually to the point where they were claiming that Square Enix ethics department had forced Tifa's designer to shrink her boobs.
Hauptsache, man kriegt die Leute dazu, auf den Artikel zu klicken, da wird der Werbung geschaltet und wir kriegen die Moneten. Wie es eigentlich mit journalistischer Richtigkeit aussieht, das ist einfach komplett zweitrangig. Das ist so traurig. Sieht man aber in Journalismus in mehr Branchen als bloß Gaming. Bild.
A trail of YouTube reaction videos followed in their wake, and of course, folks on Twitter had opinions they wanted to share as well.
Ja,
the whole
Twitter
debacle played out exactly as you'd expect, with some fans saying it's inappropriate for an ethics department to impose their own will on character artists, while other fans called those fans a bunch of basement-dwelling neckbeards. And naturally, some people just wanted to see big boobs. A couple days later, a Japan-based YouTuber named Gaijin Hunter went on Twitter to try and calm things down.
Der Gaijin Hunter nebenbei ist die wohl Hauptquelle, was Monster Hunter angeht. Also alles, was ich von Monster Hunter weiß, ja, das kommt mit von ihm. Er ist ein fantastischer YouTuber. Aber dass er in Final Fantasy VII involviert ist, dazu Aufklärung, okay. Ich bin sehr überrascht, jetzt hier seinen Namen zu hören. Weil ich hätte es jetzt tatsächlich eher in Sachen von Monster Hunter oder so erwartet, weil offensichtliche Gründe, ne?
He retranslated the part of the interview that set the internet on fire, with the important part being that when asked about Tifa's large bust, Nomura said the ethics department requested they make sure her top wasn't loose. What really been said in Japanese wasn't about restricting her chest or shrinking her boobs, it was actually about making her clothing secure. What's more, Nomura clearly stated that Tifa's silhouette was exactly the same between her original design and her final design. No shrinkage had actually taken place.
Also, sprich, ist es eigentlich nur so, sie trägt mir einen strammen Sport-BH oder sowas in der Richtung.
To be fair to Eurogamer, the original translation about restricting Tifa's chest wasn't horrendously wrong. It was just unclear and easily misunderstood. It was all the other news sites whose trains went completely off the tracks. In the end, Tifa's chest size wasn't much different in the remake, with the exception of a few PS1 cutscenes where they were larger than her in-game model and artwork.
Okay. Oh ja.
Next up, we've got Masahiro Sakurai, the
Klassiker.
esteemed creator of the Super Smash Bros. Franchise. For context, it's also important to note that Sakurai also created the Kirby series in his late teenage years. In November 2018, more than 14 million fans tuned in to watch the trailer for Smash Ultimate's New World of Light campaign. They watched on as Gallium vaporized fan favorites like Samus, Link, Bowser, not even Pikachu was spared. At the end of the trailer, only one character managed to survive, and of course, it was Kirby. Out of all 74 characters, it just so happened to be a tiny pink puffball who was going to turn the tides and save the world from Gallium's wrath. Fans accused Sakurai of being biased in favor of his own creation, and those accusations came to a crescendo a few weeks later when Sakurai addressed the situation in his bi-weekly Famitsu column. Just a few months earlier, Nintendo Everything rode in to save the day on that Masuda quote, but the situation played out a little differently this time. They published a summarized translation of Sakurai's column that read in part, quote, "Regarding Kirby, Sakurai admitted that he's a bit biased as he created the IP, and fans suspicious on that front are correct." The story was essentially copy-pasted by Newsweek later that day, and the quote seeped into YouTube videos, Reddit posts, and Twitter threads all across the internet.
Aber das Ding ist, auch wenn ich weiß jetzt nicht genau, ob das jetzt der Wahrheit entspricht oder bla bla bla, Sakurai konnte es begründen. Das ist es nämlich. Für ihn gab es nur 3 Kandidaten, die sowas hätten überleben können. Palutena, Bayonetta und Kirby. Und von diesen 3 Kandidaten, wer eignet sich eigentlich am besten dann für den eigentlichen Start? Sind wir mal ehrlich, das ist doch ja wohl Kirby, ne?
With some fans expressing annoyance and in some cases outrage over Sakurai's blatant bias. But that's actually the opposite of what Sakurai said. The next day, Smash Bros. Fan site Source Gaming published a full word-for-word translation that showed Sakurai wasn't admitting bias. He was predicting that's what some fans were going to assume, while also denying bias was the reason Kirby survived the massacre.
Da
Here's the
war es
full
nämlich,
text
ne?
with the keywords being, "So why did I choose Kirby? It must be because you created the Kirby series. I thought you might say that. But from a game design perspective and based on process of elimination, Kirby was the obvious choice. Only a vehicle that could defy the laws of physics would actually work." He goes on to later explain that Bayonetta or Palutena could have also conceivably escaped, but World of Light only needs to start with one character. Kirby has a simpler moveset that's easier for beginners, so for the sake of game design, Kirby as the sole survivor objectively made the most sense.
Ja.
Now, while some outlets eventually covered the full translation, a lot of the earlier articles based on the mistranslation were never corrected. Kirby undoubtedly
Ja,
has a
warum soll man das die auch dann überarbeiten, wenn man sowieso schon die Klicks bekommen hat? Also, ja. Aber hey, Source Gaming, das ist nur einer von vielen Beweisen, wo die sich mal bewiesen haben. Und die haben sich häufig bewiesen. Glaubt mir.
in Sakurai's heart, but he made a pretty good case for his starring role in the World of Light. So it's probably not entirely fair to say his decision was motivated by personal bias. You guys remember that time Sega said Nintendo's just for little kids? In our final story, we're going to talk about Toshihiro Nogoshi, the chief creative officer of Sega as well as the producer of the Yakuza series. To celebrate the company's 60th anniversary in 2020, Sega Europe conducted an interview with Nogoshi and posted it on their YouTube channel with English subtitles. About 12 minutes into the half-hour video, Nogoshi appears to throw some shade at Sega's old rival Nintendo, saying, quote, "I think even now the Nintendo platform is still a game console that is played by a wide range of age groups. But basically, I think it's hardware for kids and teens." Now, only a few thousand people watched the video, but the quote went viral after a Yakuza fan site called Tojo Dojo went on Twitter and shortened the quote to, "Nintendo hardware is for kids and teens."
Ja, man braucht einfach diese harte Schlagzeile, die in einen Tweet passt. Einfach mal wieder ein bestes Beispiel von Twitter-Journalismus. Eklig.
Sega fans and Nintendo haters memed on it pretty hard, and more than a few Nintendo fans got salty and returned fire with some shade of their own. Nintendo news sites called wind of the drama and ran the shortened quote as headlines, plugging their articles back onto Twitter and adding more fuel to the flames. And yeah, by now you probably already know what happened next. YouTubers reacted. Redditors talk trash, and survivors of the great Sega vs. Nintendo console war picked up their rusty old weapons and jumped back into battle. This time, it wasn't a fan-run news site, it was Sega themselves guilty of poor translation. The next day, Gaijin Hunter had to go on Twitter and try to cool things down again, pointing out that the quote wasn't as hostile as the shortened version, and that a more accurate translation should have read, Nintendo's platform has and continues to be played by a wide range of age groups, but I think in general their hardware is strong when it comes to kids and teens.
Ja, da sieht man einfach mal, ist schon wieder ein komplett anderer Kontext. Er hat eigentlich gesagt, ja, die Plattform wird von ganz vielen verschiedenen Altersgruppen gespielt. Ganz vielen. Die allermeisten sind aber wohl eher Kinder und Teenager. Da ist wohl so, diese Altersgruppe ist die prominenteste auf Nintendo-Konsolen. Und er hat nicht gesagt, Nintendo-Konsolen sind für Kinder und Teenager. Das sind zwei komplett unterschiedliche Aussagen.
So yeah, some folks on Twitter still considered it an insult, but Gaijin assured them there was nothing in the original Japanese that suggested Nogoshi was being hostile or condescending whatsoever. And besides, the full clip shows that Nogoshi was actually talking about Super Monkey Ball, the first Sega game ever released on Nintendo console, which Nogoshi himself created 2 decades earlier. The fact that he's a Yakuza guy and those games weren't ported to the Switch had absolutely nothing to do with it. So yeah, Sega's non-ideal translation and the way it was taken out of context for clickbait made it sound like he was dismissing Nintendo consoles as just for kids, when all he really said was people of all ages love Nintendo and they've been especially successful with the younger generation. A few news sites reported the correct translation, but a lot of console war combatants never heard the real story. And rumor has it that some of them are still out there fighting even to this day. Now, before we wrap things up, we just want to say that most of the news sites we talked about in this video act in good faith and report the news responsibly every single day. Nobody's perfect. We've made mistakes. Mainstream news makes mistakes. Everyone makes mistakes. But you know how it goes. Sometimes mistakes slip through the cracks and take on a life of their own. At the risk of sounding presumptuous, here's some advice for journalists and viewers alike. Next time you see the internet catch fire over an interview translation, take a moment to consider the source before deciding whether to join in or not. Who knows, maybe you'll still want to, or maybe not. We're not your dads, do whatever you want. At the end of the day, we don't really care, honestly. This video was written by...
Ja, ich finde es, also erstmal das Video geschrieben bei Push Dustin, oh wunderbar, toller Typ, wenn es um solche Sachen geht. Und es ist einfach schön, dass Omni das vorgetragen hat, wirklich, das passt einfach so wunderbar zu ihm. Aber ja, Moral von der Geschichte. Jedem Scheiß im Internet glaubt man eigentlich nicht. Ne? Also, ganz wichtig. Es ist immer wichtig zu wissen, was der Kontext ist und ob da nicht vielleicht irgendwo was dran sein könnte. Weil wenn es von jetzt beispielsweise aus dem Japanischen ins Englische übersetzt wird, kann andauernd irgendein Unfug bei der Übersetzung bei rumkommen. Und wie ihr gesehen habt, ein paar kleine Details können sehr viel ausmachen.